My name is Fatima Syed. I'm the Ontario reporter for the Narwhal, and I'm really excited to bring you into our very first webinar, and I'm sure not the last based on the direction this country is going in, um, about Mark Carney's major projects. It is a bit of a mouthful, but over the next hour, we hope we can unpack some of what this office and these projects mean for you wherever you are, including internationally, I guess, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but we'll see what we can do on the fly. Um, we'd love to hear where you're joining from. So you guys are already on the ball on that. I don't need to tell you. Keep sharing. Let us know in the chat. Feel free to include which indigenous nations call that territory home. And in case this is the first time you're joining a Narwhal event and it's the first time you're interacting with us, Narwhals, we're a 7-year-old digital publication that focuses on in-depth and investigative journalism about the natural world in Canada. As I mentioned, I'm the reporter in the Ontario Bureau, and we've got teams across the country, including the Prairies and British Columbia. The Narwhal's a leader of nonprofit journalism in Canada. We're supported by more than 7,000 members. So thank you so much to anyone here who's already a member. We see you, we appreciate you. Our journalism would not be possible without you. If you're not a member, there's going to be a link in the chat very soon and you can become one. And anyone who joins today will get one of our very nice toques. And I can tell you firsthand that these are the warmest, most wonderful toques you will ever own. So be a member today, get a toque. That's our bribe. um, Speaking of members, we're going to start with a little poll just so that we get a better sense of who you all are. Are you a member? Shortly on your screen, you're going to see a little box. Let us know. Insert Jeopardy music here while you all click that button. We're going to give you a minute, and the results are, wow, 65% of you are members, 35% of you are not. So there's room to grow. You know what to do. There's going to be a link in the chat. Before we get the actual conversation going, some housekeeping. So this session is being recorded and it will be available to view online. So you can watch it again if you really, really want to, or send it to people. You can look out for an email tomorrow with a link to the video and the chat discussion. We're also providing automated closed captioning. So to turn that on if you need it, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screens, you will see a show captions button. It's a little rectangle with 2 C's in it. So if you just select that, it should turn it on. If you click the little arrow next to it, you can pick your language. There's a couple of settings. If you have any issues with that, feel free to put it in the chat and one of our behind the scenes members can hopefully walk you through it as well. But see the button with CC, hit that. We got so many questions in advance of this webinar, like hundreds of questions. So thank you so much for sending those in. And hopefully some of what we're going to talk to will address that and we can get to more of them in our discussion. But if you have questions as we're talking, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click that, put your question in. Our team will do their very best to answer it in writing, and time permitting, we could even get to it in our conversation. So joining me today, I'm very are a bunch of my colleagues. We're across the country. So we've got Carl Meyer, who's the Ontario reporter and climate investigations, Drew Anderson, who's our Prairies reporter, and Shannon Waters, who's our BC reporter. Before we get into all the nerdiness of what this all is happening in our country, another poll question, just to test your knowledge. How many projects have been designated to be fast-tracked so far? So since Mark Carney started talking about major projects, how many have been designated to be fast-tracked so far? Again, insert Jeopardy music here while you all pick your number. And let's see what you guys got. So, okay, so we have a little bit of like a mix of answers. I'm gonna let Carl answer that question. So we're gonna start our presentation. So bear with me while I share with you a fun little presentation we made to help you understand all of this. And I'm gonna throw it over to Carl to help answer and verify whether you guys got it right or wrong.
Thanks, Fatima. Hey, everybody. I'm Carl Meyer, Ontario Porter Climate Investigations, and yeah, so let's work through this. So I've taken a real interest in Carney and his push for major projects, and I think something really interesting has happened over the last year, which is that Carney introduced this idea of fast tracking these major projects of national interest during the election campaign. It's in the Liberal platform. And since then, he's set up these mechanisms for doing that. And when he went to announce these projects in the fall, I think many people, myself included, was sort of primed to expect the government to be fast tracking the projects. And yet he has not actually fast tracked anything yet, technically, even though he keeps using the language of national significance or nation building or national interest. So I think this raises a lot of really interesting questions, and we'll get to that later. But now, I think a key thing to understand is that nothing has been designated a federal project in the national interest so far. And what is happening, as a few of you picked up on, is that Carney's referring to these projects to an office that his government set up for consideration as a national interest project. And so I think a good way of visualizing this, or the way I've started visualizing it, is there's actually three buckets of projects that we're talking about. So I've called them the long list, the short list, and the national interest list. Um, so the long list is the government looking at a bunch of projects at various stages for potential referral to his special office. And we don't know what's on this list. The government said they won't comment publicly on which projects they're considering. Um, we only know the second bucket, which is the short list. These are the projects that Carney has actually announced. So he's made two announcements and a bunch of initiatives, and those are kind of all over the place. Some of them are projects that are far along. Some of them are basically just promises to do something someday. Some of them aren't projects at all. They're strategies. And as far as we know, these are still proceeding as normal through the regulatory and approval process, except with some help from this office, which I'll talk about. And the third bucket is this national interest list. These are the projects that will receive special status under the Building Canada Act, which is part of Bill C5. And nothing's on this list yet. And you can check that out because it's published by law as Schedule 1 of the Building Canada Act. You can look it up online, and we'll know when something is on there because the government has to amend Schedule 1 to put the project's name on it. So what is happening right now? What's happening is the projects are being evaluated and helped along by the Major Projects Office. So let's talk about what that is. First thing to understand, I think, is that this didn't come out of nowhere. The Major Projects Office absorbed a previous agency in the Trudeau government called the Clean Growth Office. So that was focused on similar things like coordinating federal permitting, except it had a specific emphasis on projects that were meant to fight climate change. And another important thing to understand, the Major Projects Office is a special operating agency. So that's a designation. Previously, the government has used it for like small things like the Translation Bureau or the Passport Office. This is the first time a special operating agency has been created inside the Privy Council Office. So that is the administrative arm of cabinet. And its scale is much, much more vast. So what is the Major Projects Office doing right now? In general, the government is saying it's trying to help along these projects Carney's been talking about. So trying to lock up financing on the project, make sure it's competitive with other jurisdictions, trying to line up permits so that are happening in parallel instead of sequentially, trying to line up labor force to get started on construction. And it's vetting these projects for potential inclusion as a national interest project. So what happens when they actually do want to designate something as a national interest project? Well, I mentioned it's part of the act. The process is laid out in the legislation, and it's a bit convoluted. We've laid out some major steps in the next slide here. I'm not going to go over each one right now, but the key point is that when the government figures out what it wants to designate, it's going to publish a 30-day notice in the Canada Gazette in their official public notice publication. Consultations are supposed to happen. Cabinet's supposed to pass an order adding the name to the Schedule 1 of the law, like I mentioned. Then they're supposed to publish a description of the project and the reasons why it's in the national interest, and cost estimates and timelines. And it's at this point that the project can get sort of pre-approved for these regulatory requirements. And those are listed under Schedule 2 of the law, if you want to go look that up. So these are things like the Species at Risk Act, the Navigable Waters Act, the Fisheries Act. And finally, the government will publish this conditions document where they have measures that are supposed to protect the environment and Indigenous rights after they've reviewed things like national security. So yeah, I'm going to throw it to my colleagues who are going to talk about more about what this means for provinces, starting with Shannon and B.C.
Before we do that, though, we'd love to know which provinces you're all from. You know which provinces we're from. We've got Ontario, BC, and Alberta represented in this webinar, but please give us a sense where in Canada you live or you're joining us from today. Um, Again, this is all our way of getting to know you better. Wow, so many people from BC and Ontario. We love to see it. And hello to the East Coast who are showing up as well. Thank you for joining us in the Yukon as well. That's awesome. And Quebec. So yeah, we're gonna start in the West Coast. So over to Shannon.
Good morning, everybody, and special welcome to all the folks from BC. It's nice to see that representation, especially at a time when it seems like the federal government is both paying very much attention to BC and not quite as much attention as some might hope. So I'm going to talk a bit about where BC is at with this major projects office and the province's own push on fast tracking, which actually began before Mark Carney was even elected. So when the United States imposed tariffs on Canada at the beginning of the year, BC announced its own list of projects that it intended to fast track in response to those tariffs. The justification being we needed to stand on our own 2 feet, as the Premier David Eby is fond of saying, and really sort of focus on promoting Canadian types of development. So those 18 projects were mostly natural resource projects. There's a lot of mines on there, but also wind projects, which the province eventually introduced legislation to fast track as well. So BC was well on its way to sort of focusing on fast tracking projects very much in a similar way to what was later announced at the federal level. So in the spring, we had 2 pieces of legislation that were specifically aimed at fast tracking projects. One, as I mentioned, focused on renewable energy and transmission lines. That was Bill 14. And then we got Bill 15, which is a much broader piece of legislation that gave our infrastructure minister the power to designate almost any kind of project as being provincially significant. And that designation would make it possible to fast track that project in all kinds of ways, potentially exempting them from environmental assessment, which is something that Bill 14 specifically did for renewable energy projects and the North Coast transmission line. But also bypassing things like the Heritage Act and other pieces of legislation at the minister's discretion. As you can imagine, and for folks in BC, you might remember, there was a lot of backlash to that bill. First Nations in particular were very concerned about it, partly because the government later admitted that they had not done the consultation that was expected of them with First Nations before introducing that bill. There are also concerns about reduced oversight and potential impact on First Nations consultations going forward. So the fun thing about that piece of legislation, the government said, yes, we did fail to consult properly, but we will make sure we do that in developing the regulations. But we need this bill to pass. They made it a confidence vote. There's a lot of drama around that. And now here we are in December. The bill passed back in May, and they're still working on the regulations for that piece of legislation. So we haven't actually seen what that fast tracking means, and we haven't had any projects designated as provincially significant yet. So here I just want to touch on something that makes BC a bit unusual in the Canadian context because we are talking about the federal government designating projects in the national interest. And that is about BC's relationship with First Nations and the fact that most of BC is not covered by treaties, unlike the rest of Canada. So we have a few treaties. There's some Treaty 8 nations up in northeastern BC, but for the most part, uh, First Nations in BC, their territory has not been ceded. Their rights have not been extinguished in most cases. There are various treaties being negotiated at this point in time. We've also had court cases around treaty rights, but it's a very different landscape when governments are discussing things like major projects with First Nations here in BC as compared to the rest of Canada. Okay, so let's talk about what the federal government has been doing and where BC stands when it comes to the Major Projects Office. So, as BC Premier David Eby is very fond of saying, BC has sort of been punching above its weight in terms of these major projects. There have been 4 from BC that have been referred to the Major Projects Office at this point in time. 2 of them are LNG projects. We've got LNG Canada Phase 2, which has been permitted for years and basically is just awaiting a final investment decision. Salisson's LNG, also permitted and awaiting a final investment decision. The Red Chris mine expansion has been winding its way through the regulatory process. And the North Coast Transmission Line is actually a public project. So that one is being helmed by the provincial energy utility, BC Hydro, and it's meant to deliver electricity from sort of north central BC out to the northwest coast to electrify industry. So on the one hand, you have BC, has 4 of the 11 major projects that have been referred to the Major Projects Office. There's also one of the strategies, which Carl mentioned, is in BC. It's called the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor. It's pretty vague at this point in time, but it includes mining and LNG development, a port expansion, land use planning, and some conservation efforts sort of centered on northern BC and an emphasis on the Northwest. So one more time, BC is sort of leading the pack when it comes to major projects. And then you have this project that Alberta wants, a pipeline, which has been fairly, we'll say, vociferously opposed here in BC. And with that, I will throw it to my colleague Drew over in the Prairies.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so unlike BC on the prairies, and particularly in Alberta, this is more about politics than actual projects at this point in time. It's about confederation, it's about oil and gas, with like a little sprinkling of electricity and critical minerals. But there are real consequences to sort of what's being discussed here and what's happening. Alberta, under Danielle Smith's United Conservative Party, has been pushing for more sovereignty for Alberta and fanning the flames of outright separatism, all while aggressively working to increase oil and gas production and restrict renewables. So that's sort of the backdrop for this big pipeline announcement that happened last week. And it seems, at least for now, that Carney has bought some peace with a premier that's been threatening to break up the country if she doesn't get what she wants. Jury's still out on whether she did. It's a heck of a tightrope that Carney's walking to get that peace. He's raising expectations for industry in Alberta that could cause more anger and resentment if they're not fulfilled. He's angered BC, as we've just heard, and coastal First Nations. And there's real fierce debate around, emissions reductions versus industrial development right now. And he's walking that tightrope as well. While the focus has been on the pipeline with this agreement last week, it's about more than that. There's the Pathways Carbon Capture Project in the oil sands, which is a massive undertaking. There's, of course, the pipeline, which still doesn't have anyone who wants to build it. But there's also a call for increased power generation to support AI data centers in the province and dramatically increasing electricity sharing between BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. All of that is in this, pipeline agreement. Perhaps more significantly, given the hurdles that are actually in place to prevent this thing from being built, there's a lot of hoops that need to be jumped through before we get to that point. there are these environmental impacts that could come from this. The deal would force Alberta to accept increased carbon pricing, which has been hailed as a real big win. But aside from at some point going up to $130 per ton, the details still need to be negotiated between a province that is, fairly hostile to emissions reductions. Plus, Alberta, which will control that carbon pricing scheme, revamped the process earlier this year. And those sort of, carbon pricing, it's not necessarily tied to emissions reductions here. Um, the deal will also allow tax credits for enhanced oil recovery, which is, kind of an insane thing to do if you're actually talking about emissions reductions. It's sort of like, punching yourself in the face to, cure a black eye. I mean, it is literally pumping carbon underground so that you can produce more oil to produce more carbon. And then finally, there's the rollback of the clean electricity regulations, which Alberta, with its fossil fuel grid, has bristled at. So there's all of these things incorporated in it, and they could have significant impacts on emissions policies and industrial development. Next door in Saskatchewan, you can expect to see the province push for its own carve out of the electricity regulations. But the major focus there will be critical minerals, including uranium, which of course could feed, hypothetical reactors on the prairies or the real ones in Ontario, where my colleague Fatima will break things down for us.
Okay, so welcome to Ontario, Canada's most populous province. As Doug Ford likes to keep reminding Mark Carney, 40% of Canada's population lives here. So we really need some of that major office love. And we fact checked this while making this presentation. It's actually 39%. So someone needs to tell the premier, maybe at the next conference. Look, Doug Ford was I would say among all the premiers, the first to start really tooting the horn about building quickly. He's been saying this since the pandemic. Um, I can count 6 bills off the top of my head that Ontario has passed to speed up development. And since Donald Trump's tariffs, he's taken this message national, and he continues to be very vocal about this. Now, while Mark Carney was passing Bill C5, which is the bill that, manifested major projects, Doug Ford passed Bill 5 almost at the same time. And that bill, if you've read the Narwhal reporting, and there should be some story links coming to you in the chat throughout this presentation, weakens a bunch of rules that protect the environment, protect mining, oversee mining activities, adhere to Indigenous rights and so forth. The most egregious thing the bill does, though, and the one that's caused the most concern, is that it empowers cabinet to create special economic zones, where the laws that do remain can be circumvented to facilitate development of designated projects by trusted proponents. Now, no such special economic zones have been announced, but if you follow Ontario politics closely, you'll remember that when this bill came out, the first one that the Ford government did signal its intention for is the Ring of Fire. Now, this is in Northern Ontario. It's a very environmentally sensitive peatland. This is where all of Ontario's minerals are. It is also home to dozens of Indigenous communities. And when the Ford government announced this, there was immediate outrage because none of them had been consulted in the creation of this bill. And this bill would have huge impacts if it were to result in the fast tracking of mining activity. The Ford government corrected course. They added the legal obligation to consult First Nations into the bill. Then they did do, they held 4 consultation sessions, which one chief described as disingenuous to me. The feedback they received through those sessions was very much about accountability. Things like, let's create a public registry. If you're going to do this, create a public registry of special economic zones. Tell us why they're being declared, what you're going to do there, et cetera, et cetera. Have time limits on who can be a trusted proponent. None of that feedback was incorporated into the regulation, and we don't know what's going to happen yet. Nothing has been fast-tracked provincially, so we'll wait and see. Now, from a federal perspective, though, the Ford government wants that major project love for a bunch of projects, from highway expansions to transit to nuclear, and of course the Ring of Fire. But neither of these are on the list. Only two Ontario projects have been announced as major projects by Mark Carney. Um, the first is a nickel mine in Timmins, Ontario. And then the second is a nuclear project that would build the first small modular reactor in the country. Now, both of these projects have been in the works for a long time, and they're planned to be operational by 2028. So it's unclear what fast tracking means. But very quickly, the nickel mine has great environmental impacts. According to the impact assessment filings, it's anticipated to result in the destruction of 147 hectares of fish habitat, over 11,000 hectares of critical wildlife habitat. It's expected to seep a lot of harmful chemicals into rivers in the area that are used, and 8 lakes that are currently used by Indigenous communities, where it would toxicify the water. There's a lot of support for this project, but they want studies to be done to mitigate these harms. So it's unclear why Mark Carney would sort of fast track this one if even the community is saying they want to, make sure they do this properly. Darlington, similarly, nuclear, we all know that nuclear has its concerns. The biggest one, of course, is what do you do with the waste? We still don't have a plan to bury it. We have a location. It's Ignace, Ontario, again, in Northern Ontario, but that's not operational yet. And on top of that, it's going to be very, very expensive to build this. Already it's behind timeline, and does fast tracking mean we're going to throw more money at it? We don't know. So we'll find out. Now, what does this all mean? Now, we at the Narwhal love to pose our existential questions to Drew Anderson. So I'm going to give Drew the final word to make sense of it all.
I should just put out a caveat there that that's a very bad idea. They shouldn't do that, and neither should you. Um, but I mean, like, on the question of whether this means anything or not, I mean, yes and no. I wrote a column that sort of tongue in cheek said this was about nothing, but there are real consequences to what's happening. There are no projects that have been designated for fast tracking. All of the projects that have been announced to date were already in development, some well advanced. On the pipeline front, I mean, there is no pipeline, there's no route, there's no budget, there's no private company that wants to build this thing yet. So for now, we're dealing mostly with political theater. It's the Carney government trying to show that it is moving, that it is getting things done. Even if that's not strictly true, it's signaling, but it's also working to shore up investments. So there's a little bit of substance there at this point. But largely at this stage, it's politics. Again, there's a dangerous tightrope, I think, to walk. And it's unclear what the reaction will be if these promises or perceived promises are broken. I'm in Calgary. I'm not sure people outside of Alberta, for example, understand how much of a tinderbox it is here, how close we are to sort of those breaking points for a lot of people. And there's massive socio-political consequences if we get this wrong. Not to mention the impact of rolling back environmental regulations in the process. A lot of politics at play, but that said, once we're through these initial stages and the politics makes way for a true test of what's outlined here, there's going to be some serious questions and concerns related to what it means to, leapfrog regulations, and build, baby, build, as they say, in the midst of a climate crisis, a trade war, and national unity tensions. Big existential questions.
So thank you for listening to us break this all down. We thought it was important to give you a sense of what this all means and get into the granular a little bit. And we now love to get into your questions. And I'm going to just throw one out there while I figure out what's been happening in the chat and find those questions. And I'll start with one that a lot of you sent us, which is, how does all of this impact our ability to fight the climate emergency here in Canada? I know there's a lot of concern about it amongst our members, and maybe Carl, you can start by unpacking that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I think a number of things. First of all, strictly talking about the national interest projects designated under the federal law, there will be that conditions document that is supposed to lay out which conditions the proponent of the project has to follow to preserve the environment. We don't know how strict those are going to be. It's up to the government. And we don't know, in terms of this pre-approval process for the regulations, how that is going to affect on the ground scrutiny of the project and what it will do to the environment and to climate. But another thing I'd say is that over top of all of that, we have Canada's and provincial environmental laws. And those are being changed right now by the Carney government. Rolling back consumer carbon pricing. I could name a whole bunch of things. A big one in the Alberta deal was allowing the tax break for carbon capture to be put towards what they call enhanced oil recovery, which is essentially taking the carbon that you've captured and injecting into the ground to get more oil out. In other words, more carbon you're going to burn. And so if those things happen, then I think it's hard to say how we're going to lower our emissions when we're going to be doing projects that are raising them, like fossil fuel projects.
I love that you mentioned carbon capture, Carl, because we got a bunch of questions about that. So hopefully that helped people
Oh, happy
understand.
to talk about that too.
But before we go to carbon capture, Shannon, do you want to weigh in with the provincial perspective on how this impacts province's ability to fight climate change?
I mean, I think it kind of depends on the province. Like here in BC, we've already seen this move to potentially set aside environmental assessments for all kinds of projects from, renewable energy, primarily wind and solar, to massive transmission lines, to potentially anything that cabinet decides is provincially significant. So in a way, BC is already making a lot of those changes. We don't know what those look like. And at the same time, we have what's going on at the federal level. So I would say that everything is very up in the air at this point in time. And I really don't feel like I have a good sense of where it's going to land. I'm waiting to see the regulations on the legislation that BC has passed. I'm waiting to see what it means if these projects are actually designated in the national interest. So if you take the changes that BC is already moving ahead with, and then you look at what is happening at the federal level, potentially everything changes, but nothing changes. So if we start exempting all kinds of projects from environmental assessments when it's considered convenient or required in order to get them done as quickly as possible or make their corporate backers comfortable with investing in the province, we could see a lot change. I'm really interested to see what the interaction between the changes BC has made and what's happening at the federal level, what those interactions are like, what that means. So, take for instance the North Coast Transmission Line. It's a public project in BC. The province has already fast-tracked it to the nth degree. And so what does it mean if it is designated a project that's in the national interest as well? Does it go twice as fast? Do we have no real oversight at all because both the province and the feds have decided we need to get this done? We don't know what that's going to look like yet, which makes it a very interesting time to be trying to follow along with all of this political theater and the very real policy behind it, as Drew pointed out.
Yeah, and I'll very quickly add here in Ontario, the Ford government has removed the legislation that requires it to even create climate targets or a climate plan, and has also weakened I would say all of the environmental regulations that Ontario has in place right now, everything from conservation authorities to anything that would protect the environment from, unchecked development. We don't know the impacts of all of that yet, so it's something we are following closely, and hopefully we'll have better answers for you. Other than let's see what happens. Drew, we have so many questions from you, so we're gonna do rapid fire, okay? So we're gonna do rapid fire. Are you ready?
Oh God. Okay. Yeah.
Um, okay, number one, do you think Carney threw Danielle Smith a bone by signing that MOU?
Oh God, if I knew the answer to that. I mean, that is the big debate right now, right? I think the sort of genius of it is that people can't figure it out yet, like who sort of came out on top. I think Carney bought himself some peace. I think he did throw her some bones. I think the proposal as it's written right now, like Danielle Smith gets to say that she got a win because she's moving towards a pipeline, but my God, if you look at what needs to happen to get to that point, it's hard to see a path forward for the actual project happening with private dollars.
Okay, number two, what do you mean when you say we're in a tinderbox in Calgary? Politically?
In Alberta, yes, politically. I mean, we see the rising separatist sentiment. We see a provincial government that's actively stoking it and making it easier for things like a separatist referendum. We see, at least up until very recently, nothing but nonstop antagonism towards Confederation, towards the federal government, and making unilateral demands that, if they're not met, threatening the integrity of the country.
Okay, number three, Premier Smith is claiming that any private sector investment, oops, hold on, chat just moved, will not come unless and until the feds confirm the project on the major projects list and sweep aside legislation. Is there any merit to this? Is funding truly dependent on the federal list, or is it expected the feds will pay for the whole pipeline as it did TMX?
I mean, the agreement explicitly says private ownership, and private financing of it. There seemed to be a lot of caveats in the announcement in person when he was up on stage. Essentially, private owned was floated, but there's also public dollars that will be probably used to backstop. I mean, it says that they can use public dollars to backstop Indigenous involvement and ownership. When it comes to the Pathways project, we're talking about massive amounts in terms of tax incentives that are going towards that. We're probably looking at some sort of subsidization for the pipeline. We're probably looking at subsidization. They mentioned incentivize for AI data centers and the electricity that's needed there. So, yes, this pipeline is supposed to be privately owned, but we're still talking about massive amounts of federal dollars and provincial dollars that are going to go towards these things.
Okay. Are there any, oh, hold on. People are adding questions and then it moves. Are there any conditions on how the industrial emissions tax in Alberta is spent?
Very good question. Details TBD. They're supposed to negotiate that on or before April 1st, 2026. The only thing that we know is that at some point the price will rise to $130 per ton. Alberta froze it, I believe it was earlier this year. And so that's been cited as a win that they're actually going to move the price up. We don't know if there's going to be increases after that. We don't know what the details would be. And Alberta's own system, they rewrote the rules earlier this year. So instead of, companies paying into the tax and then that pool of money being funneled back into projects that people will use to actually reduce emissions, companies in Alberta can now invest in their own projects to avoid paying that carbon price. But there's no guarantee that those projects that the companies are investing in will actually lead to emissions reductions. So, carbon pricing by another name, but now sanctified by this agreement with the federal government.
Okay, everyone give Drew a round of applause for that rapid fire. Okay, Carl, your turn. Is there any sense on whether the impending nature strategy will affect any of these projects?
Oh, great question. I really could not answer that. I think I would say, if you look at Carney's climate competitiveness strategy that he released essentially in the budget, it's a very pared down hard to even describe it as a strategy compared to, the emissions reduction plan that the Trudeau government came out with, much longer, much more comprehensive. Also, there have been comments that, oh, that's not actually our full climate strategy. So whatever this nature strategy is that comes out, it's hard to tell if it's going to be the full comprehensive strategy. So yeah, that's all I can say on that one.
Um, and then, sorry, I'm just looking for the other question. Right. So there's a question about like the national perspective here. So there are some serious trade barriers between the provinces. The Carney government is trying to lead a working together attitude across Canada. Is that possible through projects, or will everyone behave like Danielle Smith?
It's possible, yeah. I think when you say everybody behaves like Daniel Smith, I mean one example of that is the special treatment that they have now given Alberta in the federal Alberta deal. Doug Ford in Ontario almost immediately came out and said, look, Ontario would like the same kind of treatment, and that is several people have pointed out. One way that this all gets unraveled is that each province, asks for special treatment. I'll remind everybody that actually that was one of the first things that started to show a chip in the Trudeau government's climate strategy was when they started talking about a deal in the East Coast for fuel oil. And so, the provinces seeking special treatment for things, is it going to be a race to the bottom? I can't tell the future, but that's a possibility for sure.
Okay, and then Carl, can you speak to the role of Canadian investors in all of this, Canadian or foreign? What is the role of Canadian institutional investors? Are there points to leverage there with major projects?
The government is trying to do that, the federal government. So, first of all, in terms of like federal, like crown corporations, like the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the one that houses the Canada Growth Fund, is they're trying to get those involved. So there's that element. There's also major institutional investors in the pension plans. Also, it's worth pointing out that the large oil and gas companies are publicly traded companies and have a proportion of investors involved in those are not Canadian. But whether that's going to tip the scales one way or another, who knows?
Okay, and then give us your 30-second rant about carbon capture.
The first thing I'd say about carbon capture is it is real in the sense that we have carbon capture projects in the country. Some of them have not performed at 100% effectiveness. But the main thing I think people need to understand is the oil sands, just the oil sands, is 90 million tons of emissions per year. And we are capturing just a few million tons of carbon through carbon capture right now. And so scaling that up to 90 million tons a year is a huge, unprecedented undertaking and very expensive. And also, I would say, okay, I'm going over the 30 seconds, but this has been something that's talked about for many, many years. You can go back and look at statements from previous natural resource ministers, going back through the Trudeau government, the Harper government, all talking about how we're going to be depending in part on carbon capture to lower our emissions. And that has not happened yet in a big scale in Canada. So over many years, this has sort of been promised and it hasn't come to fruition. And I think you should ask yourself, why is that not the case? One of the things being it's very expensive. Another thing being that just the scale is enormous.
That's definitely over 30 seconds, but we'll give it to you. At this point in time, I'd like to bring Alberta and BC together to fight about pipelines because we do have some questions about this. Okay. So considering the relationship, oops, hold on, it just moved. Considering the relations between Alberta, BC, First Nations, and climate change, what is the best case scenario for Carney on the pipeline? What can we realistically hope happens here? What is he going to win? What does he want to avoid? BC, Alberta, fight.
Well, I'll let Alberta go first, since it seems to be their voice that is the loudest one on this issue at this point.
You know what? I find that a really interesting question because it goes to the motivation of Carney, and I don't think we understand what the motivation is. Is Carney a climate champion? Is Carney a big money man? Is Carney interested in seeing the pipeline? Is he interested in appeasing Alberta? What is actually happening behind the scenes on this and what the motivations are? I think, if we're looking at Carney from the perspective of someone who cares about climate change and wants to see these things move forward, this is a brilliant sleight of hand. And what he wants is not to have a pipeline built. To buy political peace and not have that go forward. Um, but maybe I'm wrong, and maybe he is a big believer in, the power of carbon capture and storage, despite what Carl outlined. And he does believe that we can have it both ways and want to see that move forward. I'm not entirely sure why he thinks buying peace with Alberta at the expense of, coastal First Nations in BC is wise, but maybe Shannon has some insight into that. I don't know. We're supposed to be fighting. Let's fight.
I do have some thoughts on that front. One, I think there's something about the Rocky Mountains that like blocks BC from the federal view. They just like nobody can see us over here until there's like an LNG project to push forward or something. Um, I do like, regardless of what Carney is after, the optics of the way the MOU was negotiated with both coastal First Nations and the BC government saying, hey, we want to be part of this. It involves our province, our territory, our rights and title, and just basically being told, like, no, you can wait. We're going to figure this out with Alberta and we'll tell you what's going to happen when we're done. So regardless of what the end game is for the pipeline, I do think there are going to be some repercussions to that. But one of the things that has come up in the many, many times Premier David Eby has been asked about what is going on, what his understanding is, what it means for his government, the way this is being handled, is BC doesn't really have a lot of recourse. If the feds decide to go through with this project, BC has challenged a pipeline before and said, we don't want this. We don't think that this should be forced upon us. And that was Trans Mountain. And we all know how that went. So we've heard the premier say basically, like, we're not going the legal route again. If the feds decide they're going to proceed with this, we'll make our objections known. We'll try to make a deal as best we can, but we're not going to take this to the courts. To me, the biggest hurdle for the pipeline to become a reality, aside from potentially, the private sector support or whatever, is First Nations rights and title and how some First Nations feel about this project. I have yet to see any public support come out from a First Nation saying, yes, we want to talk about this. Yes, this could be good for us. Yes, we can see a path to supporting this. Most of it has been pretty vocal condemnation of even considering lifting the tanker ban in order to have this pipeline go forward. And I've sort of reading between the lines in some of the comments from both the politicians and the First Nations leaders, the courts are where that remedy would be sought if they try to push the pipeline forward. So I think it's an interesting time in BC. I've said a couple times that we're starting to hear some of the rhetoric that I am familiar with coming out of Alberta, that sort of grievance politics, like we're not getting our fair share, the feds aren't listening, they're not supporting our priorities. That would be softwood lumber is a big one right now. And that's not something that I have heard in my time as a political reporter. It's certainly been part of the discourse in BC before, but I think you are starting to see a bit of a turn in BC from being, a really close partner with the federal government in a lot of ways, seeing a lot of support, helping to carry forward things like climate action. BC being sort of, the last bastion of the carbon tax in certain ways when we had our own until it was done away with this spring. And I think that tide has begun to turn, and we might be heading into a direction where true Western alienation, including the westernmost province in this country, could be more of a thing than it has been in quite a while.
Should I play devil's advocate and sort of talk about, Alberta versus BC in other terms? I mean,
I
For
feel
one
like we need to
thing,
do a part two of that
oh,
just
we
because we
need to
have
do a
so many
part two?
questions to get to.
I'll
I'm
leave it. I'll
sorry.
leave it.
We can take this
We'll
offline,
have to give
Drew.
let BC have the last word for once, Drew. Jeez.
Ugh.
Um, I have a couple of questions about pathways, and we've got 8 minutes left, and I've got three more questions I'd like to get to. So, there's a question about pathways here, about what is the role of pathways here. What can we expect from them? I have lost the question. Hold on. Nope, it's gone. But there was a question there about pathways. So maybe Carl, Drew, give us a brief, look like overview of pathways role here.
Well, I can talk about what's in the agreement and let Carl talk about sort of pathways more broadly because he's definitely written about it. But I mean, the agreement is sort of if this, then that sort of thing. But it's almost like a circular. It's like you have to have the first phases of the pathways project underway before the pipeline can start. But the pipeline like they're dependent on each other. So it's a really confused sort of timeline about like what has to happen first. Like pathways has to happen for the pipeline to happen, but the pipeline's contingent on the pathways. Like they both sort of have to be in place for the other one to exist. So it's I don't know. It's confusing as to like how that's exactly going to fit together, and negotiations are still going to continue. But essentially, it's a way to, in theory, decarbonize a lot of those barrels that are moving through that pipeline. Whether that's realistic or not, over to carbon capture, Carl.
Yeah, a few things I think are worth pointing out. First of all, we're talking here about their operational emissions, which means the stuff that they emit while they're digging up the oil. It's not the emissions from all the oil they're digging up. Canada exports most of that, mostly to the United States. So those emissions are being counted in the United States. And so another thing is that agreement with Alberta that actually fundamentally changes the whole philosophy behind the Pathways promise, which is that ties it to this pipeline. Originally, in 2021, when they first formed and started talking to the government, there wasn't a precondition of a new oil pipeline to expand the capacity. It was simply to talk about the extension of the oil sands life. We had started talking about it, phasing out the oil sands. Getting bitumen out of the oil sands it's a very costly and very expensive, time-consuming thing to do. You need large upfront capital costs to start a big oil sands project. There were, shale oil revolution going on, which was cheaper to do and quicker to do. And this was sort of, we're going to position ourselves so that we can continue selling our oil in a quote unquote decarbonized way. There wasn't this oil pipeline attached to it. And the other thing is with Pathways is they formed almost immediately after they formed, they started lobbying the government on the emissions cap. And it's worth pointing out, my colleagues are annoyed at me saying this over and over, that the Trudeau government had talked about the emissions cap as this thing that would backstop the oil companies doing what they say they were going to do, which is cut all of their operational emissions with carbon capture and store it underground. It was a measure to ensure that they stuck to that promise. And the Carney government says we don't need the emissions cap because they're going to be capturing other emissions. Well, that was kind of the point of the cap, was to make sure that they followed through with that promise. So,
Um, Drew, in 30 seconds, please talk about AIMCO. And what the role of the public pension, the Alberta Investment Management Corp, will be in funding this pipeline.
Whoa, that was a curveball. Don't know. The only real mention of public dollars is through things like tax incentives and backstopping for, Indigenous participation. AIMCO, I mean, there's been tremendous speculation and controversy around the province seizing more political control over that giant pot of money and using it to shore up the oil and gas industry as opposed to investing in things based solely on returns, actually using it as a fund to prop up Alberta's industry.
And speaking about Indigenous consultation, there was a question in there about, how do we ensure governments will, meet their constitutionally required duty to consult First Nations in Ontario and nationally. And I will say, I think First Nations will make them. There are a lot of court cases happening in Ontario right now in regards to Bill 5 and what's happening in the Ring of Fire. That is slowly moving its way through the courts, and we don't know what the result will be. But you have First Nations arguing in the courts that this is a failure of a government treaty relationship and it needs to be rectified. So we'll see the results of that. But we're hearing from a lot of Indigenous communities constantly about these projects, and then we're sort of working hard to learn more about sort of the impacts and what they're doing. So stay tuned on that. And then like guys, in 20 seconds, okay? I am sorry, each of you, 20 seconds. There were a bunch of existential questions in the chat about, is there a way to actually build things in a way that does protect the environment, that does meet our duty to consult Indigenous communities, that does think about, the bigger, grand future that we want to leave behind in Canada? Is that possible? And are the decisions that our government making right now, can they be course corrected if needed to hit that future? I know, really existential. So maybe we'll go Shannon, Carl, Drew. 20 seconds.
I mean, yes, I think that we have had systems in place. The Environmental Assessment Office in BC is far from perfect, but it does oversee a process for evaluating projects through a variety of lenses. We have a bunch of regulators that have done that. Consultation has never been perfect, as so few things in politics are. I think what is concerning right now is that governments seem to be moving in the direction of more control within bodies like cabinet and things like the Major Project Office, and less transparency, fewer opportunities for public comment and public education around what these projects are aiming to do and the impacts that they could have along the way.
Carl.
I think what I'd say is, a lot of what's been going on now has been cast as an issue of investor uncertainty. And I think you could actually make the opposite argument that investor certainty would come from having a regulatory and legal regime that doesn't change government to government. We have had these battles over environmental laws for many years. And to have a government come in and start changing them once again, how does that contribute to investor uncertainty? I think you could make the argument it does the opposite. So I would say having environmental rules in place that don't change over time and that everybody knows the rules of the game.
Okay, and existential expert Drew.
We're all gonna die. I think no, I think it is possible. I agree with my colleagues, but I think we're in an era where regulations writ large are demonized, and I don't think that's true. They're in place for a reason. I think that you can have efficient and effective regulations. I think that industry has to stop fighting every single regulation that's put on them. And I think we need to accept the fact that we can do this more efficiently. There's a real argument to be made that, a lot of the pancaking and complexity of regulations is due to things like the oil and gas industry pushing back on every element. So I think we need to have hard conversations, but we don't need to eliminate regulations. We just need to figure out a way to effectively implement them and then, build, baby, build, I guess.
And I will add that I read recently that optimism is a weapon. There are so much about all of this that we still don't know, right? The fine print hasn't been released. The regulations are not fully out. People are already pushing back, and we don't know what the result of that will be. So thank you to all of you for joining and wanting to learn about this and wanting to take this information and spread it around. We so appreciate you. Our journalism would not be possible with you. As a reminder, you become a member, you get a toque. So do consider that. If you have more questions, and I know you did, and I'm sorry I didn't get to them, our emails are our first name at thenarwhal.ca. You can also reach out to editor@thenarwhal.ca. The questions will find us. And before you go, there's going to be another little pop-up box. We'd love to know what you'd like us to cover, to report on, or to continue covering and reporting on. So that might pop up. If not, just put it in the chat. And yeah, this will be available to watch. Thank you to my colleagues for joining us and being okay with me forcing them to answer questions in 20 seconds. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. We'll see you again soon.